The October wind howled through the Adirondack Mountains on the night of October 13th, 1996. 26 miles from the nearest town, nestled between towering pines and the dark waters of Mirror Lake, sat a modest log cabin that would soon become the center of one of New York's most baffling missing persons cases. Inside that cabin, newlyweds David and Rebecca Hartwell should have been celebrating their 3-month anniversary. Instead, by sunrise on October 14th, they had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a scene so bizarre that investigators would spend the next 26 years trying to make sense of what happened in those final hours. The Hartwells were not your typical missing persons case. David, 28, was a mechanical engineer from Albany who had just landed his dream job designing aircraft components for a major defense contractor. Rebecca, 25, taught 4th grade at a small elementary school in Schenectady and was beloved by her students and colleagues. They met at a coffee shop in downtown Albany in 1994, fell in love over shared books and weekend hikes, and married in a small ceremony that July. Their families described them as cautious, responsible people who always checked in, always had a plan. David carried emergency supplies in his truck. Rebecca never went anywhere without telling someone where she'd be. They were the kind of couple who sent postcards from vacations and called their mothers every Sunday without fail. The cabin belonged to David's uncle, Thomas Hartwell, a retired forest ranger who had built the structure himself in 1978. Thomas had offered the young couple free use of the property for their delayed honeymoon, and a chance to disconnect from the world and enjoy the autumn foliage that made the Adirondacks famous. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles away through dense forest. Cell phone coverage was non-existent. The only communication with the outside world came through an old rotary phone connected to a landline that ran along the single dirt road leading to the property. David and Rebecca arrived at the cabin on Friday, October 11th, just as the maple trees were reaching their peak crimson glory. They had packed enough food and supplies for a week-long stay. David's truck, a burgundy 1992 Ford F-150, was loaded with camping gear, Rebecca's art supplies, and several mystery novels she had been eager to read. Their plan was simple: spend 7 days hiking, painting, reading, and enjoying married life away from the pressures of work and city living. The last confirmed contact with the couple came on Saturday evening, October 12th. Rebecca called her mother, Janet Morrison, from the cabin's landline at exactly 8:47 p.m. Janet would later tell investigators that her daughter sounded happy and relaxed. Rebecca described the beautiful fall colors, mentioned that David had caught 2 trout for dinner, and said they were planning a long hike to Eagles Peak the following day. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. Rebecca promised to call again on Tuesday. She never got the chance. When Tuesday came and went without word from the couple, both families grew concerned. Janet Morrison tried calling the cabin repeatedly throughout Wednesday, but the phone rang endlessly with no answer. David's parents, Robert and Linda Hartwell, drove to the cabin on Thursday morning, October 17th. What they found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The cabin appeared normal from the outside. David's truck sat in its usual spot beside the building, keys still in the ignition, gas tank nearly full. The front door was unlocked, which was not unusual for such a remote location. But inside, the scene defied explanation. The couple's belongings were scattered throughout the cabin in a pattern that suggested neither struggle nor hasty departure, but something far more mysterious. Rebecca's suitcase lay open on the bedroom floor, clothes neatly folded but somehow arranged in a perfect spiral pattern around the bag. David's hiking boots sat precisely in the center of the living room, laces tied in identical complex knots that Robert Hartwell had never seen his methodical son create before. In the kitchen, investigators later found what would become one of the case's most puzzling clues. The canned good in the pantry had been opened and emptied, but the contents were nowhere to be found. 23 cans of soup, vegetables, and fruit, all opened with a manual can opener that was discovered on the kitchen counter, still bearing traces of tomato sauce. The empty cans were lined up on the counter in perfect rows, labels facing outward in alphabetical order. More disturbing still was the state of the refrigerator. All perishable food had been removed and placed on the dining room table, arranged in elaborate geometric patterns. Milk, cheese, lunch meat, and eggs formed concentric circles around a centerpiece of wilted flowers that Rebecca had picked during their Saturday hike. The food had been sitting at room temperature for days and was completely spoiled, filling the cabin with a sickly sweet odor of decay. The couple's personal items told an equally strange story. Rebecca's art supplies were found in the bathroom, paintbrushes and tubes of acrylic paint arranged in a rainbow spectrum across the vanity. Her sketchbook lay open to a half-finished landscape of Mirror Lake, but the final brushstrokes seemed different from her usual style, more frantic and abstract. David's wallet sat on the bedroom nightstand, credit cards and cash undisturbed. But his driver's license had been carefully cut into 7 equal pieces and arranged in a fan pattern beside the wallet. Perhaps most chilling of all was what investigators found written on the cabin's bathroom mirror. Using Rebecca's red lipstick, someone had written a single word in shaky, desperate letters, "watching." Below it, in what appeared to be David's handwriting, were the numbers 317 repeated 17 times in descending rows. State Police Detective Lieutenant Frank Castellano arrived at the scene on Thursday afternoon and immediately recognized that this was unlike any missing persons case he had encountered in his 20-year career. The strange arrangement of objects, the methodical emptying of food containers, and the cryptic mirror message suggested several possibilities, none of them comforting. "My first thought was that we were looking at some kind of psychological break," Castellano recalled years later. "Maybe the isolation got to them, maybe one of them snapped." But the more we examined the scene, the less that theory made sense. This level of organization and detail. It would have taken hours to arrange everything so precisely. And why would someone having a mental health crisis take the time to alphabetize soup cans? The search for David and Rebecca Hartwell began immediately. State police brought in K9 units, search and rescue teams, and helicopters equipped with thermal imaging. The dogs picked up the couple's scent, leading away from the cabin toward the lake, but the trail went cold at the water's edge. Divers searched Mirror Lake for 3 days but found nothing except the skeletal remains of fish and decades-old fishing lures. Search teams combed through hundreds of acres of dense Adirondack forest, calling the couple's names and looking for any sign of where they might have gone. Local volunteers joined the effort, including experienced hunters and hikers who knew every trail and landmark for miles around. The search expanded to include abandoned buildings, old hunting camps, and even natural caves and rock formations where the couple might have sought shelter. Nothing. It was as if David and Rebecca Hartwell had simply vanished into the October air. The investigation took on new urgency when forensic analysts made a disturbing discovery. Hidden beneath the arranged food on the dining room table, crime scene technicians found traces of an unknown substance on the wooden surface. Initial tests suggested it might be some form of industrial adhesive or chemical compound, but further analysis proved inconclusive. The substance had a peculiar property. It seemed to change color and consistency when exposed to different temperatures and lighting conditions. Meanwhile, investigators began interviewing everyone who might have had contact with the couple before their disappearance. Uncle Thomas Hartwell, who owned the cabin, had been visiting his sister in Buffalo during the relevant time period, confirmed by multiple witnesses and hotel records. The nearest neighbors, the Patterson family, had been away at a wedding in Syracuse that weekend and returned home only after the search began. The local authorities expanded their investigation to include anyone who might have known about the cabin or had reason to target the young couple. David's co-workers at the defense contractor were interviewed extensively. Rebecca's fellow teachers and school administrators provided statements. Both families underwent polygraph examinations voluntarily and passed without raising suspicions. The case generated significant media attention throughout upstate New York. Local newspapers ran daily updates on the search efforts. Television news crews broadcast live from the cabin, showing viewers the pristine wilderness that had somehow swallowed 2 young people without leaving a trace. Rebecca's teaching colleagues organized prayer vigils. David's engineering firm offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to the couple's safe return. But as days turned to weeks, hope began to fade. The October weather turned bitter cold, with nighttime temperatures dropping well below freezing. Even if David and Rebecca had somehow survived whatever happened at the cabin, their chances of surviving in the wilderness without proper gear grew smaller each day. Detective Castellano's investigation revealed several puzzling inconsistencies. The cabin's telephone records showed that someone had attempted to make a call at 3:17 a.m. on Sunday morning, October 13th. The call had been placed to a number that didn't exist, a disconnected line that had been out of service for over 2 years. The phone company confirmed that the call attempt had been logged, but no connection was ever established. Security cameras at the nearest gas station, 26 miles away in the town of North Creek, showed David's truck passing by at 11:37 p.m. on Saturday night, to October 12th, just 3 hours after Rebecca's final phone call to her mother. The truck appeared to be traveling at normal speed toward the direction of the cabin, and investigators could clearly identify David behind the wheel. Rebecca appeared to be sleeping in the passenger seat. But here was the problem. If David and Rebecca had returned to the cabin after 11:37 p.m. on Saturday night, what had happened to them in the hours that followed? The strange arrangement of their belongings suggested extensive time and careful planning. Someone had spent considerable effort organizing and rearranging every item in the cabin. The question was whether that someone had been David and Rebecca themselves, or someone else entirely. The investigation took a darker turn when forensic accountants examining the couple's financial records discovered something that had been overlooked initially. 3 days before their trip to the cabin, Rebecca had withdrawn $4,000 in cash from their joint savings account. The withdrawal had been made at a bank branch in downtown Albany, and security cameras showed Rebecca making the transaction alone, appearing nervous and frequently checking over her shoulder. When investigators questioned Janet Morrison about her daughter's unusual banking activity, Rebecca's mother broke down in tears. She revealed something she had kept secret for weeks. Rebecca had been receiving strange phone calls at home for nearly a month before the cabin trip. The calls always came late at night, after midnight, and when Rebecca answered, she would hear only breathing and then the line would go dead. She was scared, Janet Morrison told Detective Castellano through tears. She thought someone was watching her, following her. But David didn't believe her. He thought she was being paranoid, that it was probably just teenage pranks or wrong numbers. She made me promise not to tell anyone because she didn't want David to think she was losing her mind. This revelation transformed the investigation from a simple missing persons case into something far more sinister. If Rebecca had been receiving threatening phone calls and had withdrawn a large sum of cash just before disappearing, it suggested that the couple's vanishing might not have been accidental at all. Castellano immediately ordered a tap on the Morrison family phone line and began investigating Rebecca's recent activities more thoroughly. Bank records revealed that the $4,000 withdrawal was part of a series of unusual financial transactions. 2 weeks earlier, Rebecca had sold her engagement ring, a modest but sentimental piece that David had saved for months to buy. She had pawned it at a shop in Troy for $800, telling the pawnbroker that she needed quick cash for a family emergency. The pawnbroker, a heavy-set man named Vincent Torino who had been in business for 30 years, remembered Rebecca clearly. She had seemed agitated and kept looking out the shop window as if expecting someone to appear. When Torino asked about the family emergency, Rebecca had given him a story about her grandfather needing expensive medical treatment. But according to Janet Morrison, both of Rebecca's grandfathers had died years earlier. More troubling still was what investigators discovered when they examined Rebecca's teaching schedule more closely. And for 3 weeks before the cabin trip, Rebecca had been arriving at school early and leaving late, but her colleagues couldn't account for how she was spending those extra hours. Her classroom showed no signs of additional preparation or grading. Security guards at the school reported seeing her car in the parking lot at unusual times, sometimes as late as 10 p.m., but when they checked her classroom, they would find it empty. The mystery deepened when Castellano's team discovered that Rebecca had been using the school's computer lab to research something she couldn't or wouldn't research at home. The computer's browser history revealed multiple searches for information about witness protection programs, how to change your identity legally, and methods for disappearing without a trace. She had also researched bus schedules to distant cities like Seattle, Denver, and Phoenix, and had looked up information about cash-only motels and temporary employment agencies. But perhaps most disturbing of all was a search she had conducted just 2 days before the cabin trip. How to tell if someone is following you and signs that your phone is being tapped. These discoveries painted a picture of a young woman who had been living in fear for weeks before her disappearance. A woman who had been quietly preparing for the possibility that she might need to run. But run from what? And why hadn't she confided fully in her husband or family about whatever was threatening her? The investigation expanded to include Rebecca's past, searching for connections that might explain who could have been stalking her and why. Her teaching career had been unremarkable, her students and their families uniformly positive about her work. She had no criminal record, no history of involvement with dangerous individuals, no obvious enemies or conflicts. However, when investigators dug deeper into Rebecca's college years, they uncovered a troubling incident that had occurred during her junior year at SUNY Albany. In the spring of 1991, Rebecca had reported to campus security that she was being followed by a fellow student named Marcus Delacroix. Delacroix, a graduate student in psychology, had become obsessed with Rebecca after she had rejected his romantic advances. For 6 weeks, he had followed her to classes, shown up at her dormitory at odd hours, and left disturbing notes under her door. The situation had escalated to the point where Rebecca filed a formal complaint with the university and considered involving local police. However, the harassment had stopped abruptly when Delacroix was arrested on unrelated charges involving the theft of research materials from the psychology department. But he had been expelled from the university and had apparently left the area. Detective Castellano immediately began searching for Marcus Delacroix, but the trail was cold. Delacroix had no current address on file, no recent employment records, and no known associates in the Albany area. He seemed to have vanished from official records sometime in 1992, shortly after his expulsion from the university. However, a breakthrough came when investigators contacted Dr. Helena Voss, the psychology professor whose research materials Delacroix had stolen. Dr. N. Voss, now retired but still living in Albany, remembered the incident clearly and provided disturbing details about Delacroix's behavior and interests. Marcus was brilliant but deeply troubled, Dr. Voss recalled. His area of focus was behavioral conditioning and psychological manipulation. He was particularly interested in techniques for isolating subjects from their support systems and breaking down their resistance to suggestion. I always suspected that his interest in these topics went beyond academic curiosity. Dr. Voss revealed that Delacroix's master's thesis had been titled Induced Dependency and Control, Methods for Establishing Psychological Dominance over Unwilling Subjects. The thesis had been rejected by the department's ethics committee as being potentially dangerous and lacking proper safeguards for human subjects. More chilling still, Dr. Voss remembered that Delacroix had expressed particular interest in Rebecca Morrison, even before she had rejected his advances. He had asked Dr. Voss multiple questions about Rebecca's psychology courses, her academic performance, and her personal background. When Dr. Voss had refused to discuss student information, Delacroix had somehow obtained Rebecca's class schedule and had begun attending lectures he wasn't enrolled in, but always sitting where he could observe Rebecca's reactions and behavior. He was studying her, Dr. Voss told Detective Castellano, like she was a research subject rather than a person. It was extremely unsettling. When she finally complained about his behavior, I wasn't surprised. I was only surprised it had taken so long. The revelation that Rebecca's college stalker had been specifically interested in psychological manipulation and control techniques cast the couple's disappearance in an entirely new light. If Delacroix had somehow tracked Rebecca down after 5 years and begun stalking her again, it might explain the mysterious phone calls, her fear and secretive behavior, and her desperate research into how to disappear. But it still didn't explain the bizarre scene at the cabin, or what had happened to David and Rebecca on that October night in 1996. And the search for Marcus Delacroix intensified, but investigators faced significant challenges. This was 1996, before comprehensive digital databases and advanced record-keeping systems. Tracking someone who wanted to stay hidden required old-fashioned detective work, phone calls, paper files, and personal interviews with people who might have known or encountered the suspect. A potential breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Delacroix had been treated at Albany Medical Center's psychiatric facility in 1992, shortly after his expulsion from the university. Hospital records showed that he had been admitted for a 72-hour psychiatric hold following what was described as a psychotic episode involving obsessive behaviors and threats toward a female acquaintance. The attending psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Hawthorne, had retired but agreed to discuss the case with investigators. Dr. Hawthorne's notes painted a disturbing picture of a man whose grip on reality had been tenuous at best. Delacroix had claimed that he could control people's behavior through a combination of psychological techniques and what he called environmental conditioning. He had described elaborate scenarios in which he would isolate subjects, manipulate their surroundings, and gradually break down their sense of reality until they became completely dependent on him. He had developed an entire theoretical framework for what he called orality displacement, Dr. Hawthorne explained to Detective Castellano. He believed that by controlling someone's environment completely, by removing all familiar reference points and replacing them with carefully designed stimuli, he could essentially reprogram their psychological responses. It was like something out of a science fiction novel. Except he was completely convinced it was scientifically valid. Dr. Hawthorne's notes also revealed that Delacroix had mentioned Rebecca Morrison specifically during his treatment, describing her as the perfect subject for his theories. He had claimed that she had responded positively to initial conditioning attempts, and that he was planning to complete the process once he was released from the hospital. However, Delacroix had been released after just 3 days when his behavior appeared to stabilize. He had convinced the hospital staff that his previous statements had been the result of stress and sleep deprivation, and he had signed a voluntary commitment to outpatient therapy. But according to the outpatient treatment facility, Delacroix had attended only 2 sessions before disappearing entirely. With this new information, Detective Castellano developed a working theory about what might have happened to David and Rebecca Hartwell. If Marcus Delacroix had indeed tracked down Rebecca after 5 years, then he might have spent months or even years planning an elaborate scheme to finally complete his conditioning process. The strange arrangement of objects in the cabin, the methodical emptying of food containers, and the cryptic messages could all be part of some twisted psychological experiment. But questions remained. How had Delacroix known about the cabin? How had he managed to overcome 2 healthy adults without signs of a struggle? And most importantly, where were David and Rebecca now? The investigation was about to take another unexpected turn that would deepen the mystery and raise questions that investigators are still trying to answer 26 years later. The breakthrough that would forever change the Hartwell investigation came from an unexpected source on November 8, 1996, nearly a month after the couple's disappearance. Margaret Kowalski, a retired librarian living 43 miles from the cabin in the small town of Warrensburg, contacted state police with information that would send shockwaves through the investigation. Margaret had been following the case closely in local newspapers and had recognized Marcus Delacroix from the composite sketch that police had released to the media. She remembered him clearly because of an unusual encounter at the Warrensburg Public Library 3 months earlier, in July of 1996. The man matching Delacroix's description had visited the library repeatedly throughout that summer, always requesting the same materials, topographical maps of the Adirondack region, particularly the area around Mirror Lake. He had spent hours studying property records, old surveyor reports, and historical documents about abandoned structures in the wilderness. Most disturbing of all, he had requested and photocopied every available newspaper clipping about the Hartwell family, including David's recent job promotion and the announcement of his wedding to Rebecca. He was methodical about it, Margaret told Detective Castellano. He came in every Tuesday and Thursday for almost 2 months. He never spoke to anyone, never made small talk. He just gathered information like he was preparing for something important. When I think about it now, it gives me chills. Margaret's records showed that the man had been particularly interested in historical accounts of the area's logging operations from the 1920s and 30s. He had spent considerable time studying maps that showed the locations of old logging camps, many of which had been abandoned for decades and were now hidden deep in the forest, but accessible only by overgrown trails that local hunters occasionally used. This information prompted an immediate expansion of the search area. Detective Castellano organized teams to investigate every abandoned structure within a 50-mile radius of the cabin. The task was enormous. Decades of logging, mining, and seasonal hunting had left dozens of forgotten buildings scattered throughout the Adirondack wilderness, collapsed cabins, abandoned equipment sheds, the old fire towers, and hunting camps that hadn't been used in years. The search teams faced brutal November weather as they combed through increasingly remote areas. Snow had begun falling regularly, making travel through the forest treacherous and obscuring potential evidence. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, and the short daylight hours limited the time available for thorough searches. On November 15th, exactly 1 week after Margaret Kowalski's tip, Search Team Delta made a discovery that would haunt investigators for decades. 8 miles northwest of Mirror Lake, accessible only by a barely visible deer trail that wound through dense evergreen forest, they found the remains of an old logging camp that hadn't appeared on any of their official maps. The camp consisted of 3 structures: a main cabin that had partially collapsed under decades of snow and neglect, a smaller building that might have served as a bunkhouse, and a third structure that appeared to have been used for equipment storage. All 3 buildings were in advanced states of decay, their roofs caved in and walls rotted through from exposure to the elements. But it was what the search team found inside the storage building that made their blood run cold. The structure's interior had been completely renovated with materials that were clearly much newer than the building itself. Fresh lumber had been used to repair the walls and ceiling. New electrical wiring ran throughout the space, powered by a diesel generator hidden behind the building. Most chilling of all, the single room had been divided into 3 separate sections by newly constructed walls, creating what appeared to be individual cells or compartments. Each compartment was approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, just large enough for a single person. The walls were painted stark white and were completely bare except for a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. In each room, investigators found a narrow cot with military-style blankets, a small folding table, and a plastic bucket that had apparently served as a toilet. But it was the 4th discovery that confirmed their worst fears. Scratched into the wooden wall of the middle compartment, barely visible but unmistakably present, were the initials RH and DH carved with what appeared to be a fingernail or small piece of metal. The crime scene team that arrived the following day made additional discoveries that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of what might have happened in this remote location. Hidden beneath one of the cots, investigators found a small notebook written in Rebecca's distinctive handwriting. The entries, dated from October 14th through November 2nd, provided a terrifying glimpse into the couple's final weeks. The notebook revealed that David and Rebecca had indeed been held captive in this abandoned logging camp, but the circumstances of their capture and imprisonment were more complex and disturbing than anyone had imagined. According to Rebecca's careful records, they had been approached at their cabin on the night of October 13th by a man claiming to be a park ranger investigating reports of illegal hunting in the area. The man, whom Rebecca described as fitting Delacroix's general description, had been polite and professional, asking them routine questions about their activities and whether they had seen anything unusual. But something about the encounter had made David suspicious. When the supposed ranger asked to search their cabin for evidence of poaching, David had requested to see official identification. The man had become agitated and had pulled a gun, forcing both David and Rebecca to accompany him into the forest. What followed was a 3-hour forced march through increasingly dense wilderness to the abandoned logging camp. Rebecca wrote that Delacroix had been surprisingly well prepared, carrying supplies and equipment that suggested he had been planning this operation for months. He knew exactly where he was going and had apparently scouted the route multiple times. Upon arriving at the camp, Delacroix had separated David and Rebecca into different compartments and had begun what he described as a controlled environment experiment. His goal, according to Rebecca's notes, was to study how isolation and sensory deprivation would affect their psychological state and their relationship with each other. The experiment was methodical and deeply disturbing. That Delacroix maintained strict control over every aspect of their environment. When they ate, when they slept, when they were allowed to speak, and when they could see each other. He kept detailed notes of their responses and reactions, treating them as research subjects rather than human beings. Rebecca's notebook entries revealed that Delacroix had been particularly interested in testing theories about dependency and psychological conditioning. He would provide food and basic necessities only when David and Rebecca demonstrated specific behaviors or responses that he wanted to encourage. He would allow them brief periods together as a reward for cooperation, then separate them again when they showed signs of resistance or independence. Most chilling of all was Rebecca's description of Delacroix's demeanor throughout their captivity. He wasn't cruel or sadistic in the traditional sense. Instead, he approached their imprisonment with the detached professionalism of a scientist conducting a laboratory experiment. He spoke to them in calm, measured tones, explaining his theories about human behavior and psychology as if they were willing participants in his research. He genuinely believes this is science, Rebecca wrote in one entry. He talks about publishing papers about his findings. He thinks what he's doing to us is important research that will advance human understanding of psychology and behavioral conditioning. The scariest part is how rational he sounds when he explains it. The notebook entries also revealed that Delacroix had been planning this experiment for years, not months. He had been studying David and Rebecca's routines, their relationship dynamics, and their psychological profiles since their college days. The cabin trip had provided the perfect opportunity to implement his theories in a controlled environment where outside interference would be impossible. But Rebecca's final entries, dated in late October and early November, showed that the experiment had not proceeded according to Delacroix's expectations. Both she and David had proven more resilient than he had anticipated. Instead of becoming dependent on him for psychological stability, they had supported each other and maintained their resistance to his conditioning attempts. The notebook's final entry, dated November 2nd, was brief and ominous. He's getting frustrated. David tried to escape yesterday and almost made it to the main trail. Marcus is talking about modifying the parameters of the experiment. I'm scared about what that means. If someone finds this, please know that we tried to stay strong. We tried to come home. Detective Castellano's team found no trace of David, Rebecca, or Marcus Delacroix at the abandoned logging camp. The compartments showed signs of recent occupation, but appeared to have been hastily abandoned. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the area, suggesting that the captives and their captor had left quickly and under duress. However, investigators did discover additional evidence that provided crucial information about the case's final chapter. Hidden in the generator shed behind the main building, they found Delacroix's own research notes, written in meticulous detail and spanning over 200 pages. The documents revealed the full scope of Delacroix's obsession and the sophisticated nature of his psychological experiment. He had been tracking Rebecca since her graduation from college, learning about her career, her relationship with David, and her daily routines. He had identified the cabin trip as the perfect opportunity to isolate his subjects and implement what he called Protocol 7, an advanced form of behavioral conditioning that he believed would demonstrate his theories about human psychological manipulation. But the research notes also revealed something unexpected: Delacroix's growing frustration with the experiment's results. According to his records, David and Rebecca had consistently defied his predictions about how they would respond to isolation and conditioning. Their bond had actually strengthened under pressure, and they had developed strategies for maintaining their psychological independence that Delacroix hadn't anticipated. More disturbing still were Delacroix's final entries, which showed a dramatic shift in his mental state. His earlier notes had been clinical and detached, but his later writings became increasingly erratic and paranoid. He began expressing concerns that his subjects were contaminating each other and preventing the experiment from reaching its intended conclusions. His final entry, dated November 3rd, was barely legible and deeply unsettling. Subjects continued to resist conditioning protocols. Traditional isolation methods insufficient. App must implement final phase to preserve research integrity. Cannot allow contaminated data to compromise 5 years of preparation. Will relocate to secondary site for conclusion of experiment. The reference to a secondary site prompted an immediate expansion of the investigation. Detective Castellano's team began searching for any additional properties or locations that Delacroix might have prepared as backup sites for his experiment. The task was complicated by the fact that Delacroix had apparently been planning this operation for years and had had ample time to identify and prepare multiple locations throughout the Adirondack wilderness. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a review of property records dating back to the early 1990s. Investigators discovered that a property management company based in Syracuse had been making small payments on behalf of an anonymous client for the maintenance of a defunct mining operation in the remote Siamese Ponds wilderness area, approximately 60 miles from the original cabin. The mining operation, which had ceased production in 1947, this consisted of several underground tunnels and surface buildings that had been abandoned for nearly 50 years. Access to the site required a 5-mile hike through unmarked forest trails, making it virtually inaccessible to casual visitors or accidental discovery. On November 23, 1996, search and rescue teams reached the abandoned mining site. What they found there would provide the final, horrifying answers to the Hartwell case, but would also raise new questions that investigators are still grappling with today. The main mining building had been converted into what could only be described as an underground laboratory. Delacroix had installed sophisticated equipment, including video cameras, recording devices, and what appeared to be medical monitoring equipment. The space had been divided into multiple rooms, each designed for specific aspects of his psychological experiments. In the deepest section of the mine, investigators found evidence of what had happened to David and Rebecca Hartwell, and the tunnel walls bore signs of a violent struggle. Blood evidence suggested that both victims had been seriously injured, but forensic analysis couldn't determine whether the injuries had been fatal. Most disturbing of all was what investigators found in Delacroix's final research station, hours of video footage documenting the couple's final days in captivity. The recordings showed that Delacroix's experiment had completely deteriorated by early November. His subjects' continued resistance had driven him into increasingly erratic behavior, and his scientific detachment had given way to violent frustration. The final video recordings, dated November 4th and 5th, showed Delacroix in a state of complete psychological breakdown. He ranted about the failure of his theories and blamed David and Rebecca for sabotaging years of research. The footage became increasingly disturbing as Delacroix's grip on reality completely collapsed. But the recordings ended abruptly on November 5th, and investigators found no trace of what had happened to any of the 3 individuals after that date. The mine showed signs of hasty abandonment, with equipment left running and research materials scattered throughout the tunnels. The case seemed to have reached another dead end until investigators made one final discovery that would transform their understanding of the entire situation. Hidden in a concealed compartment behind Delacroix's research equipment, they found a detailed map of underground cave systems throughout the northeastern United States, with specific locations marked in what appeared to be a planned escape route. The map showed a series of natural caves and abandoned mine shafts that connected to form an underground network stretching from the Adirondacks to the Canadian border. Several locations were marked with dates and notations suggesting that Delacroix had been preparing contingency plans for years, possibly anticipating that his experiments might eventually require him to flee the country. Detective Castellano immediately contacted Canadian authorities and Interpol, providing them with all available information about Marcus Delacroix and the possibility that he might have attempted to cross the border with his captives. But the trail had gone cold, and despite extensive international cooperation, no trace of Delacroix, David, or Rebecca was ever found. The case officially remained active but was gradually relegated to cold case status as leads dried up and years passed without new developments. The families of David and Rebecca Hartwell never stopped hoping for answers, but as the decades progressed, the likelihood of finding the couple alive became increasingly remote. Then, in the summer of 2022, 26 years after the original disappearance, a discovery in the remote wilderness of northern Quebec would finally provide the answers that investigators had been seeking for decades. But those answers would prove more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a geologist conducting mineral surveys for a Canadian mining company that was exploring a series of previously unmapped caves in the Laurentian Mountains, when she made a discovery that immediately caught the attention of both Canadian and American authorities. Deep within a cave system that showed signs of long-term human habitation, Dr. Vasquez found the skeletal remains of 3 individuals along with extensive documentation that positively identified them as David Hartwell, Rebecca Hartwell, and Marcus Delacroix. The cave had been converted into a sophisticated underground laboratory, far more advanced than anything investigators had found at the earlier sites. Carbon dating and forensic analysis revealed that the 3 individuals had survived in this underground facility for several years after their disappearance, and with the last evidence of human activity dating to approximately 1999 or 2000. But it was the documentation found at the site that provided the most shocking revelations about what had happened during those final years. Hundreds of pages of research notes, written in multiple handwritings, that revealed that the dynamic between captor and captives had evolved in ways that defied all previous assumptions about the case. The documents showed that sometime in late 1996 or early 1997, the relationship between Delacroix and his captives had transformed from a simple case of imprisonment into something far more complex. Rebecca and David had apparently begun participating willingly in Delacroix's psychological research, not as subjects but as collaborators. The research notes revealed that all 3 individuals had become completely isolated from the outside world, creating a closed ecosystem in which traditional social relationships and moral frameworks had gradually broken down. Rebecca's later writings showed that she and David had begun to identify with their captor and had eventually embraced his theories about psychological conditioning and behavioral manipulation. Most disturbing of all was evidence suggesting that the 3 had begun conducting experiments on other individuals, luring hikers and campers into their underground facility and subjecting them to the same conditioning protocols that had originally been used on David and Rebecca. The cave contained the remains of at least 12 additional individuals, all showing signs of prolonged captivity and psychological manipulation. Carbon dating suggested that these victims had been held at the facility at various times between 1997 and 2000, indicating that the original experiment had evolved into something much larger and more systematic. The final documents found at the site, dated in early 2000, suggested that the facility had been abandoned when Delacroix's physical and mental health began to deteriorate. Rebecca's final entries described caring for an increasingly unstable Delacroix while trying to maintain their underground laboratory and continue their research. The last entry, written in David's handwriting, was brief and chilling. Marcus died during the night. Rebecca is talking about finding new subjects to continue the work. But I think we have gone too far. I don't know who we are anymore or what we have become. Maybe it's time to let this end with us. The skeletal remains found at the site suggested that all 3 individuals had died within a short time of each other, possibly from a combination of malnutrition, disease, and exposure. Forensic analysis couldn't determine the exact cause of death, but there were no signs of violence or struggle. The discovery in Quebec finally answered the question of what had happened to David and Rebecca Hartwell, but it raised new and equally disturbing questions about human psychology, the effects of prolonged isolation, and the potential for ordinary people to be transformed into perpetrators of unimaginable acts. The case officially closed in 2023, but its implications continue to resonate within law enforcement and psychological communities. The Hartwell case has become a study in how isolation, manipulation, and psychological pressure can transform victims into collaborators, and how the line between captive and captor can become disturbingly blurred under extreme circumstances. The families of David and Rebecca Hartwell finally received the closure they had sought for 26 years, but that closure came with the devastating knowledge that their loved ones had not only died in captivity but had become complicit in the suffering of others. The additional victims found in the Quebec cave were eventually identified, providing closure to other families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their missing loved ones. Detective Frank Castellano, now retired, still struggles with the case's implications. When we started investigating in 1996, we thought we were looking for 2 victims and 1 perpetrator, he reflects. We never imagined that we might eventually find 3 perpetrators and 12 additional victims. But it challenges everything we think we know about human nature and the psychological effects of prolonged trauma. The abandoned underground laboratory in Quebec has been sealed by Canadian authorities, but it stands as a chilling reminder of how psychological manipulation and isolation can transform ordinary people into something unrecognizable. The case of David and Rebecca Hartwell serves as a warning about the darkest potentials of human psychology and the terrifying ways in which victims can become victimizers under extreme circumstances. Today, the Mirror Lake cabin still stands in the Adirondack wilderness, unchanged since that October night in 1996 when 2 newlyweds vanished without a trace. Local authorities have installed a memorial plaque honoring all of the victims connected to the case, but the site remains largely avoided by visitors who are aware of its dark history. The case continues to influence law enforcement training programs, psychological research, and missing persons investigation protocols. It serves as a sobering reminder that sometimes the truth about what happens to missing persons is more disturbing than any scenario investigators might initially imagine, and that the human capacity for both resilience and corruption under extreme pressure remains one of the most challenging aspects of criminal investigation. The Hartwell case will be remembered not only as a missing persons investigation that took 26 years to solve, but as a stark illustration of how ordinary people can be transformed by extraordinary circumstances into something their families would never recognize. It stands as perhaps one of the most psychologically complex and morally ambiguous cases in the history of American criminal investigation. A case where the traditional categories of victim and perpetrator ultimately became meaningless in the face of human psychological adaptation to unimaginable circumstances.